we have people want to welcome everyone and attendees as we start to join this morning. My name is Christopher. I'm the co-lead for the America the Beautiful for All Urban Parks and Green Space work group. We're gonna have some music playing while we wait for other attendees to arrive. Would encourage you to introduce yourself in the chat with your name and gender pronouns and organization or communities that you come from. And again, welcome uh, and thanks again to our panelists. Today, we'll be starting here shortly. Good morning, everybody. Baruch, I'm going to go ahead and get started if you want to go ahead and stop with the playlist. Sorry about that, everyone. Good morning. Again, my name is Christopher Ramirez. I am welcome you all to our first webinar. I am the co-lead for the America the Beautiful for All Urban Parks and Greenspace work group. I'm also the co-founder and executive director of Together for Brothers. We are a community-based organization that builds capacity for self-identified boys and young men of color to be leaders at all levels in their communities, and we focus on food justice and outdoor equity, as well as mobility justice here in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Want to go ahead and just acknowledge that wherever you are on Turtle Island, we're on indigenous land. Here in Albuquerque, I am on the land of the Tiwa and Caris peoples, Pueblo peoples that have been here since time immemorial. And so just recognizing the resistance of indigenous communities for centuries and the commitment to decolonization and indigenous land, air, and water being back in the care of indigenous communities. Want to go ahead and share some slides and make sure that you all know a little bit of the background of, give me 1 second to do that. Hopefully you're seeing the slide that gives a little bit of background. Last fall, the work group started talking about the importance of urban heat and then other extreme weather, including floods, fires, and extreme cold, and how that impacts not only our urban parks and green spaces, but also schoolyards. And so for most impacted communities, we recognized a real important time to build capacity and deal in some resources and really make connections across our communities. For those of you who are not familiar, I'm going to have Kitty go ahead and unmute and share a little bit about the America the Beautiful for All Coalition. Kitty, why don't you introduce yourself and share about the coalition?
Sure. Good morning, everybody. So again, we're all part here. Folks of us hosting here today are part of the America the Beautiful for All Coalition. This coalition was launched 3 years ago to support and drive the Biden administration's America the Beautiful initiative to conserve 30% of the lands and waters and oceans in the U.S. in its territories by 2030 and advance a justice-centered vision for conservation. And this coalition, since we've been created, has united more than 300 land and water advocates across a wide diversity of communities to stem nature loss for the communities with the most at stake. And our work is more important than ever. And we're working hard to organize our communities and defend some of these hardwood conservation gains and continue to build power with advocates at the intersection of conservation, health, and environmental justice. And I'm sure you all know we need as many voices as possible to mobilize and take action to protect the lands and waters and parks and green spaces that sustain us all. So again, thank you for joining us today. We're grateful that you're here and just being part of this and being part of our movement. And we'd love to have you join. I'll be dropping links later on in the chat for you to learn more about the coalition, join us, be with us, and be in community with us. So thank you, Christopher.
Thank you, Kitty. Want to go ahead and talk a little bit about Urban Parks and Green Space work group. Together for Brothers and myself have been participating for the past 3 years and really about the protection of not only urban parks and green spaces, but making sure that most impacted communities, right, the real important connection of grassroots and grass top. So local communities, frontline communities, and, Capitol Hill and DC, making those really strong connections. And want to talk about, we've done work from everything from transportation to outdoor spaces, to working on addressing pesticides use in urban parks and green spaces, to funding for urban parks and green spaces and other issues, including living schoolyards and the Explore Act. And so we want to continue to be champions for local communities that are dealing with this really important part of, and we're one of 6 work groups. So we know there are a lot of other issues that are connected to America the Beautiful for All. We're excited to be the Urban Parks and Green Space work group. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen and want to go ahead and thank the panelists and especially the Trust for Public Land for taking the lead for today's webinar series. And then Taj, do you want to go ahead and take it away?
Sure. Thanks, Christopher. Let me share my screen. There we go. And we'll put this in. Awesome. So, yeah, thank you, Christopher, and to the America the Beautiful for All Coalition for hosting us today. And happy Earth Week to everyone. So my name's Taj Schottland. I'm the Associate Director of the Trust for Public Lands National Climate Program. And way we're going to run today's webinar, I'm going to provide some brief overall framing and remarks. And then we're going to have a panel discussion. And it should be a really fun, interesting, hopefully informative and inspiring panel discussion. We have some fantastic folks lined up to share their wisdom and expertise. So some opening just framing. So I've been working in the climate environment space for about 15 years now. And over that time, I've seen both sort of the challenges, but also there are a lot of parts that are very rewarding and inspiring. Because on the one hand, we're seeing an increase in extreme weather and climate-driven hazards, right? That is undisputable. There are also, I think, some what I would consider some political headwinds right now in DC these days. But on the other hand, there really is a growing movement to make our communities more livable, more resilient, and more equitable. And I see so many examples of this across the country. Whether it's community-led green infrastructure in New Orleans, and they were actually just featured in the New York Times this week, which was a fantastic shout out to their work, or the work in Atlanta, building these, state-of-the-art parks that are managing millions of gallons of storm water and reducing flooding for the community, or even here, my hometown in Burlington, Vermont, the city is creating an entire climate resilience strategy centered around parks and green space. So there are a lot of reasons, I think, to be hopeful. Maybe you all already share that sentiment, and if you don't feel that sense of hope just yet, maybe you will by the end of today's discussion. So diving in, many of you are likely familiar with the Trust for Public Land, but for those that aren't, our mission is to create parks and protect land for people, ensuring healthy, livable communities for generations to come. And we are one of the largest park and conservation nonprofits in the US, and we really truly believe that access to the outdoors is not just a nice to have amenity. You all probably agree with that. It really is a fundamental human need, and it's essential to our health and well-being. Now, I promise that today's webinar is not going to be all doom and gloom. But I also think it's important to acknowledge the severity of the climate crisis and the increase in extreme weather and how it really is front and center everywhere we look. And I think this Washington Post headline sums it up best, but there are plenty of other headlines. And I think while the challenges are really daunting, you all should feel a sense of pride because whether you know it or not, you as individuals passionate about parks and green space, whether you're working in this space, volunteering in this space, organizing, you all really are on the front lines of combating extreme heat and reducing flooding. And that's because parks have a superpower. And you all probably already know this, but those parks, these green spaces, community schoolyards, trails, they really anchor communities and provide a wealth of benefits. And they're really effective at keeping us safe from extreme weather. There is a ton of research and evidence building every week, every month. There's new research coming out, journal articles, reports, studies that document all the ways that parks and community green space can keep us safe as these extreme weather events increase. So parks and green space absorb storm water. They cool urban heat islands. They protect against coastal and riverine flooding. They connect people, right? People and communities. In communities, building that social cohesion is a key indicator of how resilient you are during a time of disaster, whether it's a wildfire, an extreme heat wave, or flooding. And there greenhouse gas emissions, which are the underlying driver to the increase in extreme weather that we're seeing. So just a couple examples. I'm not going to go through all of those, but just some basic 101 framing around parks as really effective infrastructure for reducing flooding. And that's because that heavy rainfall that falls on a city with just pavement and impervious surface, that water has nowhere to go and it creates unsafe flooding conditions that are hazardous to health and well-being. Parks and green space, on the other hand, that heavy rainfall event, the water evaporates, some of it goes out into the soil, and it nurtures soil health and creates a healthier planet and a safer community. So the more green space we bring in, the more resilient we are to flooding. Extreme heat is also on the rise, and our panelists are going to talk more about both the increase in extreme heat and how parks and green space can cool entire communities. But some research that we did, which I'll get to in the next slide, shows the really significant cooling benefits in creating sort of a microclimate in these shaded parks that can serve as a cooling oasis. So I don't know if folks have access to the chat. I know the panelists do, but a fun little trivia to sort of drive home this point. If folks have access to the chat, feel free to put your answer in, what you think the answer is to this little trivia question. But we partnered with UCLA to research and document the cooling impacts of some of the green schoolyard transformations that Trust for Public Land was helping lead in Los Angeles and elsewhere. And they were able to show the cooling benefits that feels like temperature for folks in these parks with new shade structures. What do you think? Was it 0 to 10 degrees, 10 to 20, 20 to 30, or 30 to 40 degrees cooler? It was 20 to 30 degrees cooler in those shaded areas. And when you think about a heat wave, 20 to 30 degrees, that's life-saving. That cooling benefit is life-saving. So really critical benefits there. Now, we know that parks can help improve community resilience to extreme weather. The problem is that not all communities have equal access to parks and green space. And oftentimes it's the neighborhoods and populations that are most vulnerable to extreme weather are often the same communities that lack adequate parks and green space. So another piece of quick trivia, how many people do you think don't have access to a park within a 10-minute walk of home? So it's 100 million people, including 28 million kids, don't have a park within a 10-minute walk of home. And even for the folks that have access to parks, there's still a significant inequity. So our parks research team at Trust for Public Land looked at park equity and inequity across the 14,000 largest communities in the US. And what they found was that parks serving majority people of color are half as large and serve nearly 5 times more people as parks that serve majority white population. And that parks serving low-income households are on average 4 times smaller than parks that serve majority high-income households. And that's not equitable, it's not just, and it's not right. So I think that we have an opportunity, and I would even say an obligation, to address these park and green space inequities, because they're not just nice to have amenities, they really are critical to our health and our well-being. So I'll stop there. And now I want to dive into what is going to be a really fun panel discussion with 3 truly inspiring and impressive folks who are leaders in their field. So we have Aparna Bole, who is the adjunct professor for pediatrics at Case Western Reserve University. Jeremy Hoffman, who's the director of impact and evaluation and community science at Groundwork USA. And Peyton Siler Jones, who's the founder and principal at Siler Climate Consulting. So let me stop sharing. There we go. And if the panelists can come on, it looks like you guys are on screen. Awesome. First, I just want to thank you guys for joining this panel discussion. Appreciate it's a busy time of year, so thank you for coming on and sharing. Rather than me doing a long introduction for each of you, I'm wondering if you all can tell us a little bit about yourself, share what drew you to this work, and maybe if you've had a lived experience that really has shaped how you think about this work. And Aparna, we'll start with you.
Thank you. Thanks for hosting this discussion. I'm really glad to be a part of it. Happy Earth Week and happy Arbor Day, I think, right, today? So it's apropos that we're having this discussion today. I am a primary care pediatrician. I've practiced for many years in Cleveland, on the east side of Cleveland, downtown. I also have a background in healthcare sustainability and healthcare operations, and most recently was part of the Office of Climate Change and Health Equity in the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. I think, what got me into this work most pediatricians, maybe a little bit unlike some of our adult medicine colleagues, are really used to thinking about our pediatric patients, kids, in the context of their families, of their homes, of their environments, the physical and psychosocial environments that surround the kids we take care of. We are just, it's in our blood and our bones to think about that context and how it contributes to the health or illness of the kids that we serve. So I think that's something that's somewhat instinctive to a lot of us who provide primary care to children. And my patients on the east side of Cleveland disproportionately come from neighborhoods that have suffered from decades of systematic disinvestment due to racist housing policies and financial policies. Our patients suffer from the health consequences of environmental injustice, including things like lead exposure and exposure to air pollution, inequitable access to safe places to walk and play, to transportation, to essential amenities, to green schoolyards, all of the things that Taj described. So many of the patients that I take care of are experiencing health consequences of environmental injustice. So it's something that is part of my day-to-day practice, and that's sort of my entry point into this work. As far as some lived experiences that I can call upon that I think about a lot, one, during the COVID pandemic, the parks and playgrounds in Cleveland were closed for a very long time, very unfortunately. So got to really see some stark consequences of kids who did have access to places to play, who no longer had those access to places to play and walk and be active. And what we saw was the mental health effects of forced isolation and also skyrocketing rates of obesity in my patient population. And the lack of access to outdoor spaces to play certainly played a role in that. I also take care of kids on the east side of Cleveland who have never seen Lake Erie, and they live within walking distance of Lake Erie because there is no easy and safe way for some of those kids to walk and access this incredibly important jewel in our natural environment. On the positive side, I've also seen the benefits of programming in the Cuyahoga Valley National Parks that invites kids from the city of Cleveland to experience the beautiful national park system we have here. We have very accessible urban Cleveland metro parks to some of our east side neighborhoods. And then the Trust for Public Land has supported new playgrounds and parks in parts of the city that really had no access to those outdoor spaces for kids. And I've seen the joy and heard the screams of laughter from kids that I take care of enjoying those spaces. So really happy to be part of this discussion because certainly see on the front lines here in Cleveland how access to parks and green spaces can benefit children's health, and the lack thereof can be really consequential as well.
I love those lived experiences, and yeah, I can resonate with during COVID parks. Some of the parks were closed and other parks that were open became sort of central places for folks to gather and socialize safely outside. Jeremy, tell us a little bit about yourself, what drew you to this work, and any lived experiences that have guided your career so far.
Yeah, thanks, Taj, and thanks to my co-panelists for participating in this conversation. And hello, everyone. My name is Jeremy Hoffman. I am, as Taj mentioned, the Director of Impact Assessment and Community Science at Groundwork USA. We're an affiliated network of 21 place-based and people-centered nonprofit organizations that work primarily in the environmental space, but in virtually all of the locations where we work, we recognize that there are intertwined social issues that are additive and in many ways build on the kind of social determinants of health that Aparna mentioned in her introductory remarks. I come to that work after being the chief scientist at the Science Museum of Virginia for almost a decade. I live here in Richmond, Virginia, by the way. And that was a very interesting time as I developed as an educator and focused on trying to increase the awareness around climate-related issues in an urban area like Richmond and across the state of Virginia. Before that, I was a paleoclimatologist at Oregon State University, where I received my PhD, working on kind of longer time frames than definitely human experiences. So my PhD research was on the last glacial maximum in the last interglacial, which was 130,000 years ago, basically trying to figure out like how different is climate change today than at time periods in Earth's recent history? And so I come to this work from a variety of different kind of experiences and motivations around trying to get people to recognize the overlaps between climate change and their day-to-day lives. That brought me into doing some really interesting work over the last decade or so, investigating how microclimates, or how basically air temperature, precipitation, air quality vary on like hyper local scales within cities. And so many of my experiences kind of overlap in this and bring me to this work in the present. But I think one thing that stands out is in 2017, we ran the first community science heat mapping campaign in Richmond, Virginia. And like probably an unsafe thing from a doctor's perspective, Aparna, I rode my mountain bike through 110-degree heat to map temperatures across parks and neighborhoods in my city. And we found this 16-degree difference between the coolest and warmest place. I actually found one of the coolest spaces, which was in a mountain bike trail system that is right next to the river, very highly canopied, just this really wonderful place. It tends to also have lower air quality, very much suppressed noise. And so I return to this place very regularly in both my exercise and then taking people there when they visit the city of Richmond. And, I reflect on the privilege that I have to access these spaces. It's only an 8-minute bike ride from my house. And so that has unleashed a whole world of research that I will talk about a little bit more later today. But yeah, basically, I come to this as a climate scientist who's moved out of deep time that nobody has ever seen or experienced into what has shaped the feeling of walking around your neighborhood in your day-to-day life, specifically during heat waves and extreme weather events.
That's dedication, biking in 110 degree for citizen science. I like it. Peyton, tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, expertise, and some lived experiences that have shaped how you sort of approach your work.
Awesome. Happy to. Hi, everyone. I'm Peyton Siler Jones, she, her pronouns, based in South Portland, Maine, on Wabanaki land. Jeremy, total side note, but I love hearing that you did that study. We really looked to that when we were doing heat resilience planning in Boston. So that's totally cool. Didn't know that coming into this conversation. But thank you, Taj, for having me. And it's such a pleasure to be in this conversation with such fantastic panelists and colleagues. So I founded Siler Climate Consulting in 2023, and we're a worker-owned cooperative, and we work on community scale climate planning and implementation, sort of at that intersection of climate solutions and social justice. My background is in urban planning and climate policy, and a lot of what we do as a firm is working in sort of the community engagement and facilitation space. So a lot of collaboration with folks who live in these places and spaces on what resilience needs to look like in that unique community. And I'm drawn to this work, or have been drawn to this work, for so many reasons. But I think a big reason that I love working at the community municipal scale is, that's where people experience climate change. To Jeremy's point of microclimates, it's extremely local in so many ways. And so working at this intersection of policy planning and people's everyday lives is such a privilege. But I've been doing this work for about a decade, but I had not personally experienced an extreme climate event until last September, when I was visiting my family where I grew up in Western North Carolina, right outside of Asheville, in Swannanoa, during Hurricane Helene. And as I'm sure all of y'all know, I mean, this was a horrific tragedy for the state and the region. And, a 1,000-year flood event, approximately $60 billion in damages, one of the most deadly storms this century. So, not turning away from just the scale and tragedy of that experience in that moment, And I think one of the things we've been learning coming out of that storm in Western North Carolina is the critical role that outdoor spaces played in resiliency and will continue to play in recovery. And so I think that is just a very personal example for me right now, a very live example of that nexus of extreme weather and open spaces and parks. And I'm actually going to jump the gun on sharing resources, which I know we're going to do at the end too, but just like popping in the chat that there is a webinar on exactly this topic coming up in a couple of weeks that some North Carolina folks are putting on about outdoor spaces and resiliency. I have nothing to do with planning this webinar, but I saw it and I thought I will share this with folks interested. So there's another opportunity.
Thanks for sharing. Can never have too many resources. So yes, feel free to populate into the chat. Well, appreciate, yeah. So I think the three perspectives around health, climate impacts, and how communities are planning leads to a fascinating discussion. So wanted to start framing the challenge a little bit more. So I touched on it briefly in the opening, but Jeremy, can you talk a little bit about the summary of sort of big picture climate trends related to extreme weather, sort of at a national scale and at a local scale, and then how urban design can either exacerbate or mitigate some of those impacts?
Of course. And I'm so thrilled about this because one thing I forgot to mention, I was a lead author on the National Climate Assessment, which was published in the last couple of years. That's actually my resource to share. So I'm going to jump the gun with Peyton as well. You can just Google NCA 5 and access the chapters. I'll talk a little bit about it later, but most of this is reported there. It's kind of the most up-to-date authoritative resource on climate change impacts in the United States. And so I'll try my best to summarize it in, I usually have visual aids and I'll do it with emojis, but this time you'll just have to kind of create them in your head. So everyone, we probably hear these headlines across our feeds quite regularly. 2024 was the first year that breached 1.5 degrees Celsius global warming. But, kind of on average, we've reached about a degree Celsius every year for the last few years. That's, roughly 2 degrees Fahrenheit global warming. And so that warming that has already occurred has made several weather-related extremes much more likely, more frequent, and more severe by virtually every kind of way you can assess it. Things like our allergy seasons have gotten longer and stronger. Wildfires are burning more land more intensely, and that smoke is interfering with our air quality at the local level, depending on where you live. Here in Richmond, we had our worst particulate matter pollution day in like 25 years because of smoke that was coming from a fire burning thousands of miles away. And that was confidently linked with exacerbated fuel sources, poor management, as well as historic temperatures and drying conditions in the West. Now, things like wetter, as the climate has warmed up, for every degree of climate Celsius of climate warming, the atmosphere can hold about 7% more water. Now that's different depending on where you look and the intensity of the evaporation in the water cycle locally, but that contributes to really intense downpours that are happening kind of over shorter durations than they used to. So we're seeing more rain falling in a smaller area over shorter time. That promotes things like inland riverine flooding. Now, also wetter climate as the global ocean absorbs the warmth that's being trapped by the intensified greenhouse gas effect that causes it to expand to fill a greater volume. The ice that is on land in Greenland and Antarctica and the mountain glaciers across the world is melting. That's putting water into the ocean, making it go up. And so we're seeing more and more coastal areas being affected by inland flooding, storm surges because of intense storms and so on. And then hotter, that's where most of my work is in. By virtually every way we can say a heat wave exists, it's gotten worse: duration, the length of time, the frequency, how often they're happening, the season, where they happen in the course of a year. They're happening earlier in the spring and later into the fall. And then the intensity, actually, the temperature degrees above a threshold is going up as well. And we know that for every single additional increment of global warming that occurs in the future, those those indicators of extreme events get worse. So we are in control of what happens, right? So there has been some progress. Current global climate policies put us on a trajectory of like 2.5 to 3 degrees Celsius by 2100. That's about 5 degrees of Fahrenheit climate warming by 2100. It's not the worst case scenario anymore. Anything you heard of like 15 years ago, we've already changed the future. That's a really good thing to celebrate, but there's still a lot more to do to restrict global warming to below 2 degrees Celsius and try to limit it as much as possible to 1.5 degrees Celsius or below. That will require substantial reductions in emissions of heat trapping gases immediately, as fast as possible, from as many sectors as possible. But when we think about so that's global climate change, national scale climate changes. But the interesting thing is when we look at where you live, this is where the microclimatology of things gets really interesting. And so you might be surprised to find out we've actually known since like the early 1800s that urban areas elevate air temperatures above rural areas outside of the city. There's a guy named Luke Howard. He was actually more famous for naming clouds than discovering this, but nevertheless, he was the first one to really register that there was this urban heat island effect, even though we didn't call it that at the time. Now, over the last decade, our understanding of how that urban heat island effect affects people within the same city in different ways has gotten super detailed. And basically, in a nutshell, hard, dark surfaces like asphalt, they absorb more of the sun's energy throughout the afternoon and re-emit it into the air throughout the afternoon and into the evening. And so that raises hyperlocal temperatures, in particularly neighborhoods with really wide streets, very short buildings, and very limited tree canopy or parks. Those areas tend to be the places where extreme heat waves that are being made worse by climate change are made worse by the built environment. Now, on the other hand, neighborhoods with lots of trees, big contiguous park spaces, as well as dense urban environments with tall buildings that shade narrow streets, those actually tend to be places where we find lower heat stress indicators during extreme heat. And we've found that these differences can exceed 15, 20 degrees Fahrenheit during the hottest time of the day. That's largely been determined by this community science heat mapping campaigns that have been put together by Kappa Strategies and the NOAA Climate Program Office. You can look up that website at the heat.gov website, at least for now. And these urban heat risks aren't the only thing that the built environment exacerbates further. In fact, there's an urban rain island effect. The kind of capacity for a city to make the atmosphere warmer changes the structure of the atmosphere and actually promotes more intense rain over the urban core and then kind of to the east, northeast of cities. You can look up the urban rain island effect. It's been studied by Marshall Shepard at the University of Georgia for many years. And I would just want to say that we know that these, the way that a city is laid out and structured and designed is the result of urban planning decisions for, hundreds of years. Decisions made by very few people that affect all of us in the way that we interact with our day-to-day lives walking throughout our neighborhoods. And things like where we know that these practices have concentrated treeless and paved over areas into poorer and communities of color across the country, leading to patterns like how my research team, identified that formerly red line neighborhoods are systematically hotter than their non-red line counterparts in the present day, and others that showed that in over 70% of counties in the United States, across the entire United States, not just cities, counties, showed that poorer and communities of color experience hotter temperatures in the summer due to these land use decisions. So basically, we have a hotter and wetter, sneezier and wheezier climate because of climate change. And then we have neighborhoods that were designed and continue to be hotter, wetter, sneezier, and wheezier than even the background climate. So these are additive things that contribute to some neighborhoods having much higher climate risk than others.
A great overview, Jeremy, and you synthesize complex topics in such a fantastic way that make it so accessible. So appreciate you doing that. Before we move on to the next panel question, I'll just mention we're going to spend about another 15 minutes or so in the panel discussion, and then we'll move to a Q&A. So if you have questions stimulated by what the panelists are sharing, plug them into the Q&A, and we'll get to them in a little bit. So, Aparna, I want to go to you. Jeremy outlined how weather is becoming sort of more destabilized, and we're seeing more frequent and severe heat waves, rainstorms, and we know that it hits frontline communities the hardest. From your perspective as a pediatrician, what are sort of the most pressing health impacts that you're seeing as a result of this, both sort of broadly and then among the folks that you're seeing through your practice?
Sure, thank you. And yeah, that was a really wonderful overview of a lot of information distilled into a short amount of time. So I appreciate that so much, Jeremy. And I guess I would tag on two things to what Jeremy said to sort of segue into health impacts. One of which is, as you may have heard from what Jeremy was describing about some of the design decisions that have resulted in some of the exposures he described, there are design solutions that can be beneficial immediately and long into the future for our health, for children's health in particular. So climate solutions are health solutions, and they're especially health solutions for children. So I think it's really important that we lean into that hopeful message. And I think what I'll do is maybe focus on the local health impacts that I'm seeing here in Northeast Ohio, because I think what Jeremy did really well was to describe some of the global and sort of national, regional impacts that are affecting the health of communities across the country. But I think it's really important that when I communicate as a health professional, I think really tying some of that science into what we're seeing in our own backyard is really important as we sort of build awareness and collective will around investing in solutions, including parks and green spaces. So I'll just say here in Northeast Ohio, oftentimes like we will hear that a lot about coastal issues related to climate change, and those are extremely pressing. But no part of the country is not experiencing these effects, including us here in the upper Midwest and the Great Lakes area. So what my patients are experiencing, certainly extreme heat is a big issue for us in Northeast Ohio. And what you heard from Jeremy's description is that it's the geography, severity, and timing of these events that is changing very quickly across the country and world. So not only are the events themselves changing, but the degree of preparedness in different communities is variable. I mean, it is not usual, or didn't used to be usual in Northeast Ohio, for the fall athletes that I see for my sports physicals in August to have to be preparing for like 90-degree practices in October. So I have these teenage football players who, their parents are like, what is going on here? We have dangerous heat advisories for our fall sports. I mean, that's just new to us, but it's becoming a pattern. So the way we counsel our patients about protection from extreme heat is changing. I'm now talking about that a lot more, much later in the year with my patients than I used to. So my student athletes, I have outdoor workers who are adolescents who I need to talk to about protecting themselves from extreme heat. A lot of people, don't think about some of the other impacts of extreme heat. Oh, I should say, actually, another population at extreme risk for heat-related illness, babies under 6 months old who have immature thermoregulatory systems, have to talk about protecting those very young infants from extreme heat. But I was going to say, outside of some of the immediate impacts of extreme heat, like dehydration, heat exhaustion, or heat stroke, there are so many other impacts that we see in our communities as well. For example, we know that extreme heat has an impact on mental and behavioral health. It has an impact on learning and cognition. We know that children don't perform as well at school when it's very hot. So those disproportionate impacts that Jeremy just described, some of our schoolyards that have no tree cover, they don't have any shade, if they're experiencing like 15, 20 degrees hotter temperatures on these extreme heat days, the children in those schools, their learning and emotional development is affected as well. Heat also has an impact on people with chronic illnesses like asthma. It can affect pregnant people, can be associated with preterm labor. So there's a whole host of heat-related impacts outside those acute heat illnesses that sometimes we often think about. So I see that in my practice. Also, extreme precipitation is a big issue for us here in Northeast Ohio. You heard why that's the case. We have stormwater, kind of extreme stormwater runoff events that can affect the water quality in Lake Erie, disrupting here in Northeast Ohio our use of the lake for recreational purposes, and then in Northwest Ohio, affecting water quality. Some of you have seen the pictures of like the toxic algae blooms in Lake Erie that affect drinking water in places like Toledo and other places in Northwest Ohio because of those extreme precipitation events combined with agricultural runoffs and warmer lake temperatures. So that's a big health issue for us here. And then I'll just mention air quality as well. I mean, I know we're talking about extreme weather. We mentioned wildfires, though. Certainly we experienced wildfire smoke related air pollution here in Northeast Ohio, which is really unusual. That's just not something we've had to prepare for before. But also surface ozone or smog is produced in settings of higher air temperatures, and that's a big issue for my kids with asthma. So if you think about it, like I'm counseling a kid with asthma who maybe also needs more physical activity, so I'm encouraging that, but also there are these extreme heat days and poor air quality days, so I'm also having to tell them to check, the heat index and air quality, and maybe they'll need to stay inside, but they also need to be active. I mean, this is a situation where we have failed to provide a child a healthy environment to do what we want them to do, which is to go outside and play. So definitely seeing those effects in our practice. And I think maybe I'll pause there because I think that gives you a picture of like sort of the day-to-day effects that we're seeing, and would love to turn to Peyton next.
Yeah, appreciate that overview. And I think we are going to pivot shortly to sort of, you've all already started talking a little bit about solutions, and how they can address these challenges, but we're going to more explicitly get to that in 1 second. But before we do, Peyton, I just wanted to turn to you and see if you wanted to dig a little bit deeper into how structural inequities, both past and present, have really exacerbated this community vulnerability. And Jeremy's touched on it, Aparna's touched on it, but if you wanted to talk a little bit more explicitly about that.
Absolutely. And as you said, very much building on what Aparna and Jeremy just shared. But like stepping back super briefly for especially the urban planning nerds in the crowd, this idea that like space and a place is more than just sort of the physical built environment is sort of like a theoretical framework at the root of everything that we're talking about, I think. So, a place holds more than stuff. It's political and it is social. So 10 different people walking down the exact same street are going to have 10 very different experiences, if you're able-bodied or, using a wheelchair, for example, or in America, if you're a Black man walking down the street that is policed versus a white woman walking down the street, or if it's dark and you're a woman walking down the street versus a man. Like there's so many like social and political ways that people experience space. And so recognizing that climate impacts place and space at the hyperlocal level, as we've all been talking about so far, it becomes very clear that systemic inequities and climate change are just inextricably linked to one another. And I think the example Jeremy provided of racist housing policies like redlining is, a really very clear and excellent example that you can see. You look at heat resilience maps, you look at redlining maps, they're the same. And that shows up and impacts people today because those neighborhoods and places are still disproportionately communities of color. So those communities, to build on what Aparna was saying, are more likely to experience the health impacts of heat. So that's one example. But I also think it's worth mentioning that there's so many ways that we can't see how systemic inequities impact climate vulnerability. So at Siler Climate Consulting, we always start climate planning and climate vulnerability work with a social resiliency analysis. And just to provide one example of what that can mean and why that's useful and important, we're working with a small coastal town in Massachusetts that at face value is very white, very wealthy, and they have a really vulnerable grid infrastructure. So you might sort of think that's going to be a problem for everybody. Nobody wants to lose power. That's problematic for tons of people. But in working with this community, we've learned that one of the many ways that systemic issues impact folks in experiencing that vulnerability is there's a pretty significant community of folks who rely on the food pantry for their food. And so if the power goes out and all the food in your fridge goes bad, some folks are like, oh, what a pain. I have to waste all this food. I'm going to compost it, go fill it up again. But if you're relying on the food pantry to feed your family every week and you literally can't restock your fridge until you go pick up your food, the one day a week it's open in this particular town, that's a really big deal. So that's just another example of kind of how it ends up playing out. And it's going to be really place-based and really specific.
Thank you, Peyton. All right, so we've got about 5 or 10 minutes, time flies, for this panel discussion, and then we'll move to open Q&A. Jeremy, I'm actually going to turn to you next, and wanted you to just sort of talk about some of the solutions and projects that Groundwork USA is implementing, and sort of how they sort of pencil out and the impacts that they have, they're cost effective, and how they're helping the communities that they're in.
I'm super thrilled to tell you about that stuff. We're so fortunate. Head over to groundworkusa.org and look up our local affiliates that are doing incredible work all over the country. Read our State of the Network report from 2023. You really get a flavor for the kinds of hyper-local climate resilience projects that our affiliates lead, with residents involved from the start to the finish, to the maintenance. It's a really beautiful thing that we are able to support in our network. But getting to that, it's like, we know that these solutions, whether it's a park or some sort of green infrastructure or solution, have costs, upfront costs associated with the land, maybe acquiring a piece of land, the construction, the actual materials, the trees, the park stuff. Those aren't free. We also know that the people and the operations cost money up front, and these improved community resources require maintenance to be successful over time. So we have yearly, annual kind of maintenance costs associated with these things. And so understanding the full, upfront capital and ongoing maintenance and operations costs, we can get an idea of how much this park or infrastructure thing is going to cost over the course of 20, 30, 50 years. At the same time, we know that these places have huge direct and indirect benefits that we can quantify monetarily. So especially if they're designed to mitigate something like heat or stormwater or air quality or otherwise, we can value the carbon that's being sequestered into the soil. We can value the stormwater that's being offset going into the sewer systems. We can value the air quality cleaning abilities of the trees or plants that are in part of the planting plan. We can also then be evaluating things associated with the indirect benefits, like the increase of green space access and its associated benefits to things like respiratory health, mental health, and heat-related illness reductions. We can start to really quantify all of those benefits, both direct and indirect, and then project them over that same time period, 20, 30, 50 years. What's amazing is that we know that there are way more benefits than we have monetary associations from published research too. So many times our assessment of, for every dollar we put in versus what we get out, is a conservative estimate. So I'll give you an idea of some of the projects in the Groundwork network. One of them being in Jacksonville, Florida, in a historically redlined neighborhood called North Riverside. Groundwork Jacksonville worked with 20 homeowners to do reflective rooftops on their homes, as well as stormwater gardens and rain barrels in their yards. Now, what was amazing is that these reflective roofs then lowered indoor temperatures and allowed them to reduce their indoor energy use. So that's a direct benefit, was about a 7% on average energy use. Now, that doesn't sound like a lot. Over time, over especially the lifetime of that roof, that becomes quite a bit of money. And when you multiply that out by not only the houses that participated, but the many other hundreds of neighborhood residents that could benefit from a project like this, we estimate that just from the energy benefit alone, that could be $500,000 in neighborhood direct financial benefit for these cool roofs. Now, it's amazing when we think about then its exchange on things like the cool roof. It ends up being, for every dollar we put in, we get about $1.25 back in the energy benefit. Now, I also mentioned these stormwater gardens. Those offset thousands of gallons of stormwater from a stormwater challenged neighborhood in a stormwater challenge city like Jacksonville. And not only do those stormwater gardens benefit things, we also have rain barrels that slow down more rainfall from going into the sewers. We also then have things like the aesthetic benefit of improving this yard into a native biodiverse habitat. And we have things like lowering lawn costs. So we actually removed a bunch of lawns. So now these households don't need to put money into mowing, into keeping all these things up. Basically, all of that putting together all the benefits as well as all the costs, we see for every dollar we spent on these practices in Jacksonville, the community is seeing $3 returned in these benefits. And like I said, that is probably a huge underestimate. That's just one that comes to mind that I like to share because it transfers across both the kind of like environmental benefit as well as that kind of infrastructural benefit, like a rooftop.
Thank you, Jeremy. Aparna, anything to add on the health benefits specifically? And then we're going to do a lightning round of like 60-second questions and then go to the Q&A with folks that are in attendance.
Sure. Yeah, I think in addition to what Jeremy shared, the benefits to stormwater management, air quality, mitigating extreme heat, I think it's really important to talk about some of the other health benefits to children, families, and communities when we talk about park investments. And I actually think this is important strategically to create the kind of big tent approach to advocating for investment in parks, green spaces, and nature-based design solutions that we really need right now. So I'll just run through a few, and I'll put a couple links to resources in the chat that I hope will have some helpful references for you on child health benefits of these kinds of investments. But one, a lot of people think about physical activity, but I'll just say it, opportunities for outdoor physical activity are important, not only parks, but safe places to walk and get to parks. Social cohesion is a big one. And we talk about community resilience. I mean, resilience can mean a lot of things, but improving physical, mental, behavioral health and improving social cohesion, those are all parts of improving community resilience. So when it comes to child health, that means relationships between children, but also really importantly between caregivers. There are data that support improvements in social connections between caregivers of children when there's park space that can be used by families. That's so important for the mental health of parents and children. I'll also mention, that on the subject of social cohesion, we've talked a lot in our society about loneliness being kind of an epidemic. So parks can be a solution that can help us address that as well. We also have great survey data from children about sort of their subjective feelings of well-being, about being when they are able to see even, trees interspersed on their walk to school, or when they have a well-maintained park that's accessible to them. We have survey data even from young children that demonstrate that their subjective sense of well-being is improved. So I think it's not only just a feeling that we have that these things feel good to have around, but we have some qualitative and quantitative data from children and their caregivers about some of the not only physical, but also mental and behavioral health benefits of parks, green spaces, and nature-based solutions.
Thank you, Aparna. All right, so quick lightning round, then we're going to go to the Q&A, and also hopefully folks can stay with us. We had scheduled this for a 90-minute. We thought about 60 minutes, but I'm glad that we went with 90 minutes because there's a lot to cover. So just lightning round in, let's say, 30 to 60 seconds for each of our panelists. What are your favorite resources that folks should check out, either for learning more or taking action? And Aparna, we're going to go back to you. Yeah.
I was just trying to paste something in the chat and I'm unable to do two things at the same time. So I'll do that in a second. But there are a couple of American Academy of Pediatrics policy statements that might be useful for people if they just want to learn more, but also to use some of the references to support the cases that they're making around investments in park and green spaces. One of them is a policy statement on the built environment and child health. And the other one is a policy statement on climate change and children's health. And both have really great references on the health benefits of parks and green spaces. So I'll put those in the chat.
Perfect. Peyton, over to you. Same question.
Yeah, I also will kind of do this afterwards, but a couple of resources. The state of Massachusetts has a climate resilience grant program called the MVP program. And their like 2.0 has some awesome resources when it comes to doing those social resilience analyses that I talked about earlier, and also just for community engagement in general. So highly recommend looking there. I'll also drop a link to a really cool case study in Durham, North Carolina, around their green infrastructure work and historic racism. So I'd recommend checking that out. And then I'll also just drop a couple other links to resources that I think are really solid in terms of engaging communities around parks planning, but also climate planning more broadly.
Awesome. Thank you. And Jeremy.
I mentioned it earlier, but the National Climate Assessment came out in 2023. There are chapters associated with topics that you might be interested in, like public health or transportation or built environment or agriculture, as well as regional chapters. So regardless of where you live in the country, you can have a kind of regionalized impact assessment and kind of narrative portions, highlights from different projects. For example, we highlight the Princeville, North Carolina flood management program. That was a BRIC program from FEMA, as well as indigenous stories on how like the Gullah Geechee actually updated FEMA guidance to allow for heirs property to be included in their post-disaster funding plan. So I would encourage you to go and read about everything that's in the National Climate Assessment, because I'm sure you'll find something interesting and useful for your mission.
Awesome. And I'll share just a couple resources that come to top of mind. So one is parkserve.org for folks that aren't familiar. It maps out existing parks, priority locations for new parks to serve folks that don't have a park within a 10-minute walk. And then it brings in equity data, health data, and urban heat island data. So you can figure out where parks can deliver all of those benefits. All right. Thank you all for sharing so much fantastic information. We've got some questions coming in through the Q&A, and thank you, Tia, who is behind the scenes going through the questions that are coming in and summarizing them for us. So keep entering in questions and she'll surface them to us. So the first question is, do you have any insights into how to balance disaster resilience, the cooling properties of parks, and the restoration of the US's diversity of ecosystems? So I'm sort of interpreting that around broader ecosystems and biodiversity. Do any of the panelists want to take a stab at that? And I
can jump in.
Yeah, go for it, Peyton.
I am not qualified to answer this question fully, but I did, when I read that, I thought of Brett Kincairn out in Colorado. He's in the same region, and his work at the Center for Regenerative Solutions. And I feel like that's his bread and butter, is thinking about native plants and how to design climate from a really like local native perspective. So dropping the link in the chat to their work, and I would say check that out for some answers to your question.
Yeah, and I'll just chime in too that the USDA Forest Service has been so good about sharing regional community tree planting guides over the last 20 years. I mean, there is so much information that the USDA the Forest Service has out there for helping local communities determine the best kinds of trees from their local native species to promote like the most useful and adapted kind of tree planting plan. But in many communities around the country, there's been a huge revitalization of talking about native plants and and more importantly, the removal of invasive species. So now here, just for example, in the city of Richmond, Virginia, there's been a huge effort in one of the new park spaces that came out of our Urban Heat Island campaign in 2017. It's this underutilized surplus plot of land that the city owns, but it's just covered in kudzu, the vine that ate the South. Interestingly, it's actually an edible vine. You can actually eat kudzu. But anyway, the huge effort of improving that park space and getting it ready for people was a huge effort on restabilizing the ecosystem there by removing this invasive vine. So I think that there's both what we choose to plant And then also, what are we doing to restore the ecosystem from the sense of getting rid of what has taken over in many neighborhoods, things like, English ivy or kudzu, depending on where you live. And so there is, I think, a growing effort in many of the communities that we work in that works to assess, like, how do we maximize the benefits across this disaster resilience, the immediate environmental benefit to a new park, as well as establishing this kind of native plant-based and invasive removed landscape simultaneously.
Thank you, Jeremy. Yeah, there's so much good writing out there also on that. And I'll just also mention, I think it was just this week, the county of Boulder. And I'm glad, Peyton, you brought up Brett Kincairn out in Boulder. I don't know exactly how involved he was, but the county released a new guide to sort of urban nature-based solutions and biodiversity. And it's a report plus sort of an accompanying landing page. And I can try and dig that up or and share either during this webinar or afterwards, but it looked like a really promising resource. All right, fantastic question. Next question we got was, do you have any thoughts on how we quantify and measure the positive health impacts of parks and green spaces on a local scale? I'm looking at you, Aparna, probably to take maybe a first stab.
I can do that, and I'm sure Jeremy will have some things to say about this as well. I know you referenced some of the work that your organization is doing here, but the question is about on a local scale, and so just I'll comment on that a little bit because I know it can be difficult on a very hyper local scale to come up with sort of the biometric kind of measures that show differences. People think about things like blood pressure or diabetes management and things like that. And those kind of measures, it can be very difficult to create sort of like a way of correlating some specific local park investment with those kinds of outcomes. I think it's really important that we think about sort of the subjective feeling of well-being and connectedness, and how do we measure aspects of people's lived experience as part of measuring what it means to have better well-being in a particular neighborhood. Like, I think maybe this is just because I'm coming from medicine and I'm thinking we often go straight to some of these more like biometric type of measurements. And, I think this comes up as well when we talk about things like investments in grocery stores in so-called food deserts. And you don't see that there's this like one-to-one correlation. You invest in a grocery store and all of these, quantitative measures of things like blood pressure and hemoglobin A1C. Oh, there's not there's not an immediate correlation. That's true. But there are data on investments, including grocery stores, but also parks, that suggest that people's perception of their neighborhood as it being a good place to be. How connected are we with our neighbors? What's the pride that we have in place? How many neighbors do I know? How safe do I feel walking or biking or playing outside? Like those are things that you don't measure with a blood pressure cuff necessarily right away. Over time, maybe so, but the fact that those kind of subjective and qualitative measures of people's lived experience, feeling of connectedness to community, pride of place, like those things are really meaningful when it comes to the mental and behavioral health of our communities, and ultimately do have an impact on our physical health as well. So I guess I would just say I'm really encouraged by evolving methodologies of how we incorporate like place-based qualitative research in measuring well-being beyond sort of these highly kind of like vital signs-based measures. And Jeremy, I'm sure you'll have more to add to that.
No, I was just going to say, like, lift up your qualitative surveying. We're actually doing that in 3 of the cities where we've had recent investments in transforming like a vacant lot into a useful park space. And so we'll actually be diving into that kind of social kind of focus group based neighbors of the immediate surrounding area to really reflect on both the youth and adult kind of perspectives on these spaces. So I'm really glad that we are, as Groundwork USA, going to advance that work. But I also wanted to lift up, I put 3 different papers in the chat that really do focus on those kind of biometric indicators. There's a couple of different things. First, the last one that I just sent is by Eugenia South from Penn. Basically, probably the most like wonderful randomized treatment style Now, it's really hard to do this kind of work. Like the medical, actual epidemiological work is really difficult to do. But there, I just want to give you some ideas of the kinds of ways that people have done it in the past. So Eugenia South from Penn has done some really amazing stuff on randomizing whether a vacant lot is greened or improved or left alone, and then the people's kind of reaction to that. I was a co-author on a paper where we put people's biometric data from their smartwatches as they walked through different environments in the city of Richmond and looked at an indicator known as heart rate variability. Basically, it's an indicator of stress, psychosocial stress. And so we were able to show that very green, calm streets were better for people's psychosocial health as well as their heat exposure using this strategy. And then there was GPS units attached to kids in this paper that was just put out this last year by Kevin Lanza, who's a really strong like kind of climate and health impacts of Greenspaces researcher. So those three resources can give you an idea of the kinds of approaches you can take. They're certainly expanding, but the survey-based one that Aparna brought up is probably the easiest to undertake from the kind of quick distribution of and getting a kind of sentiment about the social cohesion around these spaces than kind of a longer term epidemiological study that might take a lot more infrastructure to get going.
Yeah, and I also think some of that sort of more quantitative epidemiologic data is a little easier to gather on a larger scale, and those are great examples of some hyperlocal efforts to do that. But as you said, it's difficult. Not only, well, first of all, when in electronic health records, there's a lot of variability in how hyperlocal information you can get about people's local risk factors. Like for anyone who's tried to kind of correlate like air quality with asthma exacerbations on a hyperlocal level, it's hard to do that. And also there's a trust issue, like this idea of like attaching a GPS to a child. You know, whenever I've done community engaged kind of environmental health work, sometimes there's a lot of hesitancy among community members about tracking their whereabouts or their vital signs and sending it somewhere. So that can be hard too. So that's why I think you just incorporating that qualitative component and being open to that and really embracing some of the evolving methodology in that space can be really powerful too.
Appreciate those responses. I'm going to go to a question that someone had talking about sort of current events. And so how are you all adapting to continue work with increasing pushback politically against climate issues and the denial of the existence of inequity and systemic issues in the upper levels of our government? It's a timely question. It's a challenging question. Do any of our panelists want to share? And I guess I would also challenge, yes, to talk about some of the challenges, or encourage you to some of the challenges, but also areas where we're seeing progress and hope right now.
Happy to jump in. I'm sure others have thoughts too. But I think it is worth saying explicitly that it's a huge privilege to be able to push back if your livelihood is associated with pushing back. So I know many people are in really compromised positions where they feel like their job or their funding for their organization are contingent upon them not talking about climate change and not talking about equity anymore. But I think at Siler Climate Consulting, and I know in some other places, we're in a position, at least for now, where we're continuing to call it what it is and not letting the federal context prevent us from doing that. And I think if folks have the ability to do that and to risk that, like, let's all keep doing that together, because it makes a difference. And then in terms of climate denial, I think we work with places all the time where people don't think climate change is happening, but they're talking about intense flooding that has gotten more and more frequent over time. So I think there's tons of incredible examples of communities who are responding in like incredible ways to climate change, who are not going to say that's what it is, and that's fine. So I think there's sort of both ends of the spectrum there.
Thank you, Peyton. Aparna or Jeremy, anything to add?
Sure. I think I'll speak about health-oriented messaging, because I think we know even in these divided times we live in, we know that messaging about health, and especially about children's health, can really cut across people's beliefs about climate change and also partisan affiliation. Like there are data that continue to support that. So I feel really hopeful about that. I think talking about the health of children appeals to people of all political stripes. So I think leaning in on sort of care for children as a shared value that we all have is an opportunity for hope. I also think that, we talked about all of these immediate health benefits of parks that relate to physical activity or beautifying a neighborhood or increasing social, connections with your neighbors. Like these are also things that I think can cut across political lines. So depending on sort of one's audience, I think leaning into some of those different topics to address what might be most important to the audience that we need to sort of bring into our tent can be really important. And I don't want it to sound like I'm saying avoid certain terminology, but I think, choosing words that resonate with your audience, especially as it pertains to parks, can work really well. I mean, we do it all the time here in Ohio. We have very diverse coalitions here in our state. I think, I guess those are the main messages I would say. Is I think health messaging is still quite trustworthy, especially we know that primary care providers are trusted. We know that nurses are very trusted. We know that children's health is something that brings people together. So I guess those are the things that I would say bring me hope, despite kind of all the divisions and sort of like knee-jerk responses to language and semantics. I think that we have a lot to work with to make our tent still grow bigger, even though we're living in sort of troubled times.
And I think as you heard Aparna say in the previous questions discussion, there's like each community is so unique. And so when we engage in this work, we're working alongside residents that may have lived there for 35 years. And so they've had their voice and vision for their community for a long time. And if anybody does kind of really hyper local climate work in communities, that there are many layers to the onion of getting to the like park thing. We need to talk about things like traffic safety. We have to talk about things like the school. We have to talk. There's so many other things that people are dealing with that we, enter into these conversations with this resident-led shared leadership model of how we get to that space together. So I think, working at the hyperlocal level, you learn that this kind of audience-based understanding of how am I delivering my message in a way that connects us through our values is a huge step in understanding how to continue doing this in the near future.
I really love that. And I think about like in primary care, how so often we're counseling families whose values may be different from our own, or maybe they have like earned mistrust in medical institutions. And so we're always trying to figure out like, what is it that we can really connect on? Like for me, it's usually we both want what's best for your child, and we can start there. But I think like for me, that is really an exercise in empathy in my daily work. And what you're talking about with hyper local work is that as well. And so I think like, for me, it makes me feel sort of hopeful to know that we have some agency here. Like we can take some accountability for maybe sometimes our language makes people feel excluded and we aren't approaching a topic with empathy. Like it's not, why are people reacting in a certain kind of way to the language that we're using? Maybe we're accessing like some fear or trauma or mistrust that was earned. And so I think like if we approach it that way, to me, that feels hopeful and less anxiety provoking. Like we know how to do this if we've done local work before, or we provide service to diverse, in my case, patients. But so I think that's a reason for a lot of hope right now.
Well said. And I'm tempted to leave it there, but we've got one more question from the audience that I want to get to before we wrap up. So a question came in asking around what incentives or requirements have you seen work the best in incorporating resilient and green infrastructure improvements in new development without negatively impacting the developer? It's a great question.
Green factor scores. I think that there's a huge, so Seattle is one city that has this. I believe the Chicago Green Roof program is also like this. Basically, if a developer agrees to do things that benefit the resilience of like the stormwater system or a public park or some sort of climate resilience intervention, that then they receive a density bonus. They can add units to their development. So that balances the cost of that intervention with the long-term earnings from that particular development. So it's a way to kind of incentivize it in a way that doesn't, that adds to what they can then put on any particular place. That's one way that I've seen that implemented in different cities to achieve that kind of open green space as part of their developments.
I knew you would have a good answer, Jeremy. Go ahead, Peyton.
Just popping another example in the chat, Boston's smart utility policy embedded in their zoning code is another solid one to check out with that question.
Fantastic. All right, before we wrap up, want to give the panelists an opportunity for closing thoughts. I would encourage you, if this is what you want to cover, to sort of share your call to action for the audience members. But if there's anything else that you want to share as final thoughts, feel free, and maybe keep it to about 60 seconds or less. And Aparna, we'll start with you.
I think I already shared some of my call to action going forward, which is I think this the topic of investing in parks and green infrastructure is such an opportunity to have a big tent approach to climate solutions. This space is kind of like wide open to anyone who's concerned about children's health, beautiful neighborhoods, social connections, emergency preparedness and resilience, like all of those topics can, I think, grow our tent to really continue to make progress in this space despite the challenges that we have. So I guess I would double down on that and just say for those who are coming from more of like a planning and kind of park building space, just not to forget about the health professionals as being helpful allies for you, because there are people like me throughout the country who are really passionate about promoting healthy environments for the patients we serve.
Don't forget your health allies. I love that. Peyton, final thoughts from you.
I think a final thought, which is, again, probably preaching to the choir with this group, but just that as we're thinking about this, continuing to think about it really intersectionally and recognizing that to do this work, we need to walk, chew gum, pat our head, rub our stomach at the same time. So, thinking about housing policy as a critical whole systems component of thinking about green space and equity as just one example. So intersectionality.
And Peyton was reading my mind. The intersectionality of this topic is where you can find allies, and not only your health allies, as Aparna mentioned, but transit and transportation advocates, housing advocates, food advocates, land preservation advocates from the surrounding counties. If you're working in a city, there are so many ways to couch these the topic of enhancing and providing climate resilient space in cities that extend into all of these other groups that we unfortunately have been siloed away from in a couple of these conversations. So I would encourage people to think about and see and find out who are those other community key holders in these other spaces around transit, food, housing, and so on that can help amplify my message to reach a broader coalition of individuals. What we've learned in our work at Groundwork USA is that shared leadership and community resident-driven initiatives are way stickier than you coming in with an idea and expecting people to glom on. If it didn't come from within, it's not going to receive a lot of support.
Amazing. Well, thank you, Aparna, Jeremy, Peyton, for sharing fantastic information, inspiring, informative. I learned a lot and I'm inspired. So yeah, thank you for sharing your time. My call to action, which I'm going to pass off to Christopher in a second, is there are upcoming webinars. This is the first in a webinar series. So if you were interested in what you heard, you want to stay involved, consider attending those webinars. And there's also a working group that I believe you all can stay involved with. So again, thank you all for joining. And Christopher, over to you to see us out.
Just another big thank you, Taj, to you, to all the panelists. Thank you so much for building capacity and dilling us all into some incredible resources. What a great introduction for this four-part webinar series. Want to remind you the last Friday of the month, May 30th, June 27th, July 25th, will also be the next three webinars that Taj mentioned. In May, we're going to be focusing on local stories. And you heard today, we know the uniqueness of our communities is really important. And we're going to be learning from communities LA, Phoenix, New York, and others that are doing some incredible work on the ground that is BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color led. So excited to have those local stories lifted up at our May webinar. In June, we're going to be focusing on even more resources, right? What are the resources that we can use as grassroots and grass top organizations to address extreme weather equity, parks, urban parks, green spaces, but also schoolyards. And then we're going to focus July on policies. And that's going to include not only federal policies, but also some of the local and state solutions that we can invest in, that were some of them were mentioned today. So excited for those four-part, the next three of the four-part webinar. Want to also just lift up that Kitty's gonna be dropping into the chat. We'd love for your feedback. This is the first of four webinars. Would love your feedback so we can build that into the next three webinars. Want to remind you to please register and share the link for the remaining three webinars that we have. Want to encourage you to, I'm going to drop into the chat my email if you're interested in joining the Urban Parks and Green Space work group. You can also join the coalition. I believe Kitty is going to make sure that you have the information of both joining the coalition and signing up for the coalition newsletter in the chat as well. But I want to, Kitty, is there anything else that we should do in terms of making sure folks know about some of the next steps and actions that they can take?
This is great. No, just expect from us folks a nice detailed follow-up. There were so many resources shared today. We're going to summarize all this in an email, get you the recording also to share. So please continue to join in, be part of our community. Again, can't emphasize enough that we are stronger together, and it's going to take a village for us to meet so many of the challenges that the wonderful panelists described to us today. So thank you again, and we'll be sure to follow up.
Awesome. Thanks again to the panelists. Thanks again to all of you for participating with us this afternoon. Let's continue to, do this really important work. Want to just also lift up that we know that we want to hear from you and your stories and organizations. So don't hesitate to reach out. My email's in the chat with solutions that your communities are already implementing to address extreme weather, urban heat, extreme cold, floods, fires, how they have impacted urban parks, green spaces, and schoolyards in your communities. Please fill out those evaluations. We'd love to hear from you. We're going to send out a reminder to everybody who signed up for the webinar. And again, thank you all so much. Don't forget to drink water and take care of yourself and others, including spending time in your local park, green spaces, and schoolyards. Thanks, everyone.